Okay. Mishnah Yutet in Ein Yaakov. So we're on Yevamot daf mem tet amud bet. We're discussing, I think this is quoted elsewhere, this particular Gemara. I think it's rather famous. But it's the Gemara that talks about instances where Moshe Rabbeinu acted without divine approval, or without God commanding him to do something, and then God approving it after the fact and saying that he did the right thing. There's a list of things that Moshe did, and then God saying he did the right thing. So we'll see that there's, in particular, we'll be discussing probably the most important one, which is breaking the luchot, right? That we're not told that Moshe was commanded to break the luchot, but that he did it, and that in the psukim it seems that he did it out of anger, or we're told he got angry and he broke them, so that would imply it was impulsive. And then the question is whether that was a good thing or not a good thing. What does history say about that particular act that he performed? So we'll see what the Medrash says, and then we'll see that there's actually really two questions here that we need to answer. The first one is what we just mentioned of, was it good that Moshe broke the luchot or not? And then the second question, which I think is not necessarily what you'd think of, but is a pretty glaring question once you are told it, is that if you read the psukim themselves, God tells Moshe what's going on. In other words, Moshe is up on Har Sinai, in the 40 days finish, he gets the Torah, whatever, etc. And then God says to him, go down, because Bnei Israel have done this thing. They've made an idol, they're worshiping the idol, they've become corrupt. So Moshe has the whole walk down the mountain from when he is told by God that Bnei Israel were doing this, that we're worshiping the Egel, to when he goes down to the bottom of the mountain. So why was he so shocked? Or why was he so angry? Why did he break the luchot if God had warned him about it in advance? So let's just dive in. We'll see what the various Mefarshim have to say. So the Gemara in Yevamot and daf mem tet amud bet teaches as follows. Tanya, it says in the Braita, Shlosha dvarim asa Moshe mida'ato והסכימה דעתו לדעת המקום. Okay, so Moshe Rabbeinu did three things from his own will. And the language here is a bit interesting, and his will agreed with the will of God. In other words, it doesn't say God approved of it, but it says that was what God had intended, and Moshe was able to be in line with God's will. What were they? Pirish min ha'isha v'shiber haluchot v'osif yom echad. Okay, so he separated from Tzipora, from his wife, he broke the luchot, and then he added a day to the preparation of Matan Torah. So we'll discuss, as we said, the breaking of the luchot. So shiberet luchot mai darash. So why did Moshe Rabbeinu think it was okay to break the luchot? Amar, he said to himself, Uma pesach shu echad mishesh meot u'shlosh esrei mitzvot amra Torah kol ben echad lo yochal bo. So when it comes to the Korban Pesach, which is one of the 613 mitzvot, the Torah says that the Pesach cannot be eaten except by a Jew. Okay, so a non-Jew is not allowed to eat it. So he says, HaTorah kula v'Yisrael mumarim alachas kama v'kama. So how much more so when it comes to the entire Torah and when Bnei Israel are mumarim, when they're apostates. In other words, he says the Pesach is not allowed to be eaten except by a kosher Jew. So for sure the entire Torah cannot be given except to kosher Jews. And here we have the entire Jewish people, or a significant portion of the Jewish people worshiping Avodah Zarah, so they cannot eat from the Torah, as it were. So that's the kal v'chomer that Moshe did. Right? V'askhima da'ato l'dat hamakom, and then God agreed with him, or he was in line with God's divine will. How do we know that? Tichtiv, the pasuk says, Asher shibarta. When God tells Moshe to go back up, right? It says, Psol l'chach shnei luchot avanim karishonim, make 2 more tablets. V'chatavti ha'luchot advarim asher yu ha'luchot harishonim asher shibarta. Right? The tablets that you broke, I'll rewrite the same thing on those. So v'amar Reish Lakish, amar le'akadosh baruch hu, what does it mean that you broke? Yasher kol chacha sheshibarta. So it's not just that you broke them. So asher, he's interpreting asher shibarta does not to mean that you broke, but asher from yishur, right? From confirmation or from approval. Right? When you asher something, it means you've approved it. So asher shibarta, so God approved it. He said to him, Yash koach, and that you broke it. So the Gemara seems to say that when Moshe broke the luchot, that was something that was okay for him to do, and it was even the right thing for him to do. The Gemara in Menachot and Daf Tzadi Tet Amud Bet also has a teaching in the name of Reish Lakish, right? Who's the one who taught Yesher Kocha Sheshibarta. So the Gemara in Menachot says, Amar Reish Lakish, Pamim shebitula shel Torah, zeu yisoda. Okay, there are times when the annulling of the Torah is itself the establishment of the Torah. What is that? What is an example of this? Tichtiv asher shibarta, amlo kadosh baruch hu l'Moshe, yesher kochacha sheshibarta. Right? So he brings the same drasha, but here he uses it to teach a lesson. Right? It's not embedded within this teaching of Moshe did three things of his own volition and God agreed, but rather it's an isolated teaching where Reish Lakish ties it to this concept that sometimes you have to violate or nullify the Torah in order to make sure that it's kept. Right? This concept I think comes up in other areas under the Eit lasot Hashem ifiru Toratecha. Right? That sometimes you have to violate the Torah in order to make sure that the Torah is kept. And Rashi in Menachot here he notes that his interpretation of this is in a very halachic sense. So he says, what does that mean? Kigon shemivatal Torah leotzat amet ulachnasat kala zeu yisoda kolomar mekabel schar ki'ilu yoshevu miyasda ve'osek ba shneimar asher shibarta. So Rashi says, what does it mean? Sometimes bittul Torah establishes the Torah. So Rashi says that means to do mitzvot. In other words, if you're doing a mitzvah like hotzat amet, right, coming the dead, or chnasat kala, right, with a bride at her wedding. So the argument isn't, I can't go and do those things because I have to learn. That is you're being mevatel limud Torah in the strict sense, but you're fulfilling the Torah by going and doing mitzvot. So, or doing good deeds. So that is for Rashi the concept of bitula shel Torah zeu yisoda. But what does that have to do with the pasuk that he brings with Moshe breaking the luchot? So v'lo omar lei b'lashon kas. Shma mina v'askhima da'ato לדעת השכינה, כשביטל תורה ושיברן כדן שנתכוון לתורה. Tova. So the way Rashi understands it is to say that when Moshe broke the luchot, that's obviously bittul Torah. It's the ultimate bittul Torah because he's not giving it to Bnei Israel. But he was mitkaven tova. He did it for the right reasons. And we know that God said to him, Asher Shibarta, he didn't say it to him angrily, so God must have agreed. So we see from here that bittul Torah is the fulfillment of the Torah if you're doing it for the right reasons. So that's how Rashi understands it. The Eitz Yosef has the following teaching. Let me find it. Yeah, okay, so Eitz Yosef says, right, Yisher Kochacha. Okay, here. So the Eitz Yosef brings another midrash. He says, Uva midrash ita, Yoshua v'shivim skenim tafsu bi'adav, shelo yishabrem v'lo yachlu lo. Okay, so the Eitz Yosef brings another midrashic tradition which adds on to our Gemara in Menachot. Right, the Gemara in Menachot says that Moshe came down and he broke the luchot, and that God agreed and was approved of what he had done. So here the Medrash says that, right, Moshe comes down, he has the luchot in his hands. We know he speaks to Yoshua before he breaks them, so Yoshua is definitely there, but the Medrash says the Yoshua and the 70 elders, they grab Moshe's hands because they don't want him to break the luchot. So it adds into the drama of the whole scene. You have here the struggle between Moshe Rabbeinu and Yoshua and the Skenim on the other hand, where they're trying to make sure he doesn't break the luchot. But then v'lo yachlu lo, eventually Moshe succeeds, he breaks free from their grasp and he breaks the luchot. Right, Amar Kadosh Baruch Hu Tehei Shalom Be'oto Hayad Dichtiv L'chol Hayad HaChazaka Asher Asa Moshe V'sham Mishum Achli Hayadar Yishai Asher B'lashon Yishur V'ashrei. Okay, so and then he concludes and he says, right, that we know when Moshe dies at the end of the Torah, we're told that he was the greatest Navi that ever was. And it concludes, L'chol Hayad HaChazaka Asher Asa Moshe. So there it uses like this, the idea of a yad chazakah, the strong hand, asher asa Moshe. So the Medrash says, what does it mean Moshe has a strong hand? What are you talking about? So the pshat is, it just means that in general Moshe was a leader and he had a strong hand, right? He was decisive, etc. But the Medrash here is saying, no, it means that his strong hand was able to prevail over Yoshua and the Skenim and break the luchot. In other words, he had to struggle with them and he was stronger than them, and that's what allowed him to break the luchot, which was a good thing. And so it plays on this idea of Asher Asa Moshe, Asher from Yishur, and Ashrei of Asher Shibarta, Yesher Kochacha Shibarta. So Eitz Yosef kind of embellishes the Gemara that he quotes the Midrash which embellishes the story in the Psukim And it makes it that much more impactful, or that much more significant, that God agreed with what he had done, because he actually had to fight with Yeshua and the Skenim to break the Luchot in that moment. Let's see what it says in various other midrashim about this episode. So it brings here the Dvarim Rabbah Gimel Yud Aleph, which goes into some detail, but we'll see it inside because it has some interesting also embellishments to the story. Yarad Moshe min harakia v'hayu luchot biyado. Okay, so he comes down from Har Sinai and he has the luchot in his hand. V'lo shibran ad shara beinav. He doesn't break them until he sees the Egel HaZahav with his own eyes. Minayin, how do we know? Shneimar v'hi kasher karav l'machaneh v'yar et ha'egel. So it's clear that he gets angry after he sees what's going on, and only then he breaks the luchot. Amar lo Kadosh Baruch Hu, Moshe, lo hayita ma'amin li she'asu lahen egel, shneimar saru mehem min haderech asher tzivitim. So this is the question we raised at the beginning of this year. So the Medrash says, why was Moshe so angry and shocked and had such a visceral response? And it puts the question in the mouth of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, because God says to Moshe, did you not believe me when I told you that this was happening? Right? So Rabbanan Amrei, Mina Devar Zeh, Shakad Moshe Yachaz HaKod et Yisrael, Shamar HaKadosh Baruch Hu Asher Tzivitim. Amar Lefanav, Ribbon Shel Olam, Ani nitztiveti, Shema avarti al tzivui, Hem lo nitztavu, V'lo hayu yodim. So the way this Medrash is understanding it is it's saying that in that moment when God told Moshe that they were not doing Avodah Zarah, that they were doing Avodah Zarah, so Moshe was the ultimate defender of Bnei Israel. He used it as an opportunity to defend them, right? Because God said to Moshe, they have turned away from the path which you've commanded them, or which they've been commanded on. And then Moshe says to them, well, I commanded them, but maybe they Sher nitztiveti, Shem avarti al tzivui, Hem lo nitztavu, V'lo hayu yodim. So Moshe says maybe they weren't commanded in Avodah Zarah. How are they supposed to know they're not allowed to worship another god? Right? It's possible that they were never commanded. I was commanded because I've been up here for 40 days with you receiving the Torah. But how do I know that they ever commanded it? So Amar lo Kodesh Baruch Hu, Moshe lo nitztavu, Amar lo lav. So God says to him, really? You're going to tell me that they weren't commanded in Avodah, not to do Avodah Zarah? And Moshe says no. So Amar lo ma amarta b'Sinai, ani Hashem Elokechem, lo amarta ela Anochi Hashem Elokecha. Ma amarta lo yeh lachem elokim acherim, lo amarta lo lecha elokim acherim. Right? So the first two mitzvot are given in the singular. So Moshe says, right? It says, Anochi Hashem Elokecha, asher tzeticha me'eretz mitzrayim v'davidim, lo yeh lecha elokim acherim panai. So Moshe says, you said that in the singular, so perhaps that was being directed towards me. I am not allowed to have other gods. But why would I assume that all of Bnei Israel were commanded not to have other gods? That was Moshe's attempt at defending Bnei Israel's actions. When God told him that they were commanded, Moshe says, no, they weren't commanded. So Amar B'chia bar Abba lo iniach Moshe zavit b'arkia shelo nitchabed ba ma yomer ma pum savur mimalel. Okay, so basically Moshe did whatever it took to defend Bnei Israel. Like he was doing all these pilpulim and the psukim to try to defend Bnei Israel. So that's what this midrash is doing. In other words, the way it explains the question of why wasn't Moshe prepared already for what Bnei Israel had done, because God told him, was that he was going back and forth with God about what God had said. And God said they were commanded. Moshe says they weren't commanded. So Moshe in his head, he was arguing with God about what had happened, and so in that frame of mind is what he was in Har Sinai, but only when he came down and he saw what they were doing that he actually got infuriated. And we'll see the Maharsha actually later on really concretizes the difference between what happened on Har Sinai and what Moshe saw down on earth. I just want to look at a couple more midrashim here quickly. So the Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer in Perek Mem Hey Piskachet teaches as follows. ולקח משם את הלוחות, והיה יורד, והיו הלוחות סובלים את עצמן, ואת משה עצמו עמן. כשראו העגל ואת המחולות, ברחו הכתובים מעל הלוחות, נמצאו כבדים על ידו, משה, ולא היה משה יכול לסבול את עצמו, ולא את הלוחות, ולשליחם מידו ונשתברו תחת הר שנאמר ויחר משה. So interestingly, this tradition is almost the opposite of what the Eitz Yosef said. Because the Eitz Yosef said that, we're told Moshe had a yad chazakah, so that must mean that his arm was strong and that he was able to overpower Yeshua and the Skenim and break the luchot. right? Here in Pirkei Eliezer, it says that when the letters on the luchot saw the egel, so they fled, right? They flew up to heaven, and so the luchot went from being the luchot to just these really heavy rocks, and they became too heavy because the letters had made them lighter, and so Moshe wasn't able to hold them, and he had to drop them. So what's interesting about this measure isn't just that it doesn't say Moshe was strong in the physical sense that he was able to overpower them, but also that it takes away the responsibility from Moshe, in a sense, right? Because what we saw in the Gemara in Yevamot, and what we saw in the Eitz Yosef in the Medrash there, and even what we saw in Devarim Rabbah, is that it was Moshe consciously destroyed the luchot, that he was angry and he did it on purpose, and even that God agreed with that decision. But that was something that he even had to overpower Yoshua and the Skenim. Or it's the Medrash in Pirkei Eliezer is taking, I think, a different tone here, and it's trying to say, it's almost absolving Moshe of responsibility of what happened. Because it's saying that the letters, it was too heavy for him. What was he supposed to do? He couldn't hold it anymore, right? If he couldn't hold it, he couldn't hold it. So I think this Medrash is a bit more uncomfortable with the idea of Moshe destroying the luchot, because it's trying to absolve him of responsibility, versus the Medrash that we saw, which said God agreed with him, and Kal V'chomer, the Medrash quoted in the Eitz Yosef, which says that he even had to fight to do that, and won that battle.
So according to the meaning, go on. Johnny, you go first. So I was just going to say, meaning the answer of the Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer to the question of how is it that Moshe threw down the tablets if he knew beforehand that the Jewish people were sinning, because God told him, and why didn't he trust God? The answer is he did, and he didn't throw down the tablets, they just became too heavy for him. So there's actually no contradiction. Is that what's being...
Right, exactly. I think you're right. Pirkei Eliezer doesn't ask that question. It doesn't say, but what about the fact that Moshe already knew about them? But it answers itself, like you said. In other words, the whole question falls away if you take away the responsibility from Moshe and say that he didn't have a choice. Right? It's only a problem if you say Moshe consciously decided to break the luchot, and then you have to ask, why did he do that? And since he already knew what was going on, so why did he get angry? So yeah, it resolves both questions. It resolves, did Moshe do right? We asked two questions at the beginning. Did Moshe do the right thing? And how could he have been so affected and in the moment done that if he already knew about it? So according to the stream of thought of the Midrashim of our Gemara and the Eitz Yosef's Medrash in Devarim Rabbah, it would seem that the answer to the first question, you do the right thing, the answer is yes. But why did he do it if he knew about it in advance? So Devarim Rabbah doesn't really give a clear answer to that, right? It says because on Har Sinai he was arguing with God and he was trying to defend Bnei Israel. And so maybe as part of that whole debate, he was in that frame of mind, but only once he came down to Har Sinai, and then he saw them doing it, then he had a trigger response, which is what we'll see the Maharsha says in clearer language. Whereas for the Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer, did Moshe do the right thing? It's not really a yes. It's not he did the right thing or the wrong thing. He was an onus, right? He didn't have a choice. In other words, it could be he even did the wrong thing. It could be Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer would say, in contrast to our Gemara, that God didn't agree with the breaking of the luchot, but Moshe didn't have a choice because the letters flew up to heaven and the stones became too big. So then it's not a question of, but wait, didn't he know about it? It was out of his hands, literally.
So what was he mad about, Moshe, then, according to the Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer? He was mad that he dropped them.
So I think... Yeah, it's a good question, right? Because he says, it says explicitly he was angry, right?
Oh.
So Pirkei says here, "V'lo haya Moshe yachol lizbol et atzmo v'lo et haluchot." In other words, I guess what I'm saying is a bit too extreme. He seems to have more nuanced language here. Yeah, in other words, the luchot became very heavy for Moshe, right? Nimtzu kvedim al yado, al yadav shel Moshe. So they became very heavy, but he still actively threw them down, right? So it could be.
This bowl means not just sevel means suffering. So maybe it's Moshe couldn't suffer himself and the luchot
in that situation. I don't know. And then that's why he had to throw. He couldn't suffer this Torah being embarrassed. This is a parish that I have on the spot. But like lisbol, like lischov, again, that's the modern word, I guess, is to carry. But lisbol is more of a it's the shorish of sevel, which is like suffering. But I don't know.
So I think you're right. The question is, what does lisbol mean here? Does it mean what you just said, that he couldn't stand to see the Torah being violated in such a way, and so he threw down the luchot? But then the question is, so why do I care that they were heavy? In other words, how does that help with anything, right? If they were heavy and he threw them down because he was angry, just like we always thought, or is it what I thought the Pirkei Eliezer was saying, which is like suffering in the physical sense? In other words, Moshe could no longer tolerate the weight of the luchot because they were too heavy. He was not able for himself. So I'm not sure how. I guess it's open to both or either one. But I guess now that you mention it, it is a little difficult, because then how do you understand his anger? It seems clear he did still, in some way, he still threw it down and he still was angry, which means that the second question isn't totally resolved. But it still, I think, absolves Moshe of the responsibility by saying it was also because it was very heavy, and so he didn't really have a choice, but he still proactively did it, perhaps. So maybe it's kind of trying to have its cake and eat it too. It's a good question. I'm not sure. I thought initially when I read it, it was a more kind of straightforward teaching. Great. Let's look at the Avodah Rabbi Natan and then the Maharsha, which was at the beginning actually, to kind of close it off. So Avodah Rabbi Natan in Perek Bet Piska Gimel as a teaching as well, and he says as follows. Okay, so it's actually quite long here. Let me see what we want to. Let's read it quickly. Shiber taluchot ketzad. How did that process happen? Amru b'shah she'ala Moshe l'Aaron lekabel et haluchot she'en ktuvot u'monachot mishesh yemei Bereshit. Okay. באותה שעה היו מלאכי השרת קושרים קטגוריה משה והיו אומרים ריבונו של עולם מה אנוש כי תזכרנו בן אדם כי תפקדנו ותחסרנו מעט מאלוקים וכבוד ולדעת התורה תמשילנו במעשה ידיך כל שתך רגלת שנאה ולפים. Okay, let's get this. Okay. נטלן כי משה took the לוחות וירד and he went down והיה שמח שמחה גדולה. Okay, so he was really happy when he went down Har Sinai, right? So what is the question we immediately ask about this? That Moshe was a sameach simcha gdola when he was going down Har Sinai.
Did Hashem not tell him about it?
Right. Hashem told him that Bnei Yisrael were doing avodah zarah. So why is he so happy? So kevan shirah otos sirchon shesarchu b'maseh egel, when he saw what they were doing, amar yachani noten lahem et haluchot. So he says, how could I possibly give them the luchot? Right? Maski keni otan lemitzvot chamurot u'mechayveni otan mita mishamayim. If I give them the Torah, then I will be forcing them to do, very stringent mitzvot, and then I will bring upon them death from above for being guilty of violating the mitzvot that I'm giving them. So he turned back. Okay, Moshe actually was going to go back up Har Sinai, presumably. But the 70 elders saw him. Okay, so this is like the most dramatic telling of this story that I've ever been familiar with. You have like him holding one side of the luchot, and the 70 Zkenim holding the other side of the luchot, and they're doing a tug of war, right? The 70 Zkenim are trying to pull it back to Bnei Yisrael. Moshe's trying to run away with it. Chazak kocho shel Moshe mikulam. But Moshe was stronger than all 70 elders. Right, which is what we saw in the Yetz Yosef. Okay. So, right, then he comes and brings a mashal. Did you have a question? Right. Okay, anyways. So again, this is just like another layer of this medrash. Like this is, I think, is the most fantastic version of it, but also the one that puts by far the most emphasis on the fact that this was a conscious, like it puts the words in Moshe's mouth, something which is very heavily implied but never said explicitly in the psukim, that Moshe says, "Hey, achani noten lahem et haluchot." Right? How could I possibly give them the luchos? In other words, if you read the psukim, you could say it was just this impulse. He was so shocked by what they were doing that he dropped the luchot in anger and threw them down. But not that he had a conscious decision to say, I cannot give them the Torah because of what they're doing. It could just be that he was so angry at what they were doing that he dropped the luchot. So here we're saying, no, it was he felt that Bnei Israel could no longer receive the Torah because of the fact that they were doing Maseh Egel. And that's said explicitly in this medrash. So it adds more kavanah to Moshe's actions. Let's just close with this teaching of the Maharsha, where he says as follows. V'im tomar, lama lo yadan Moshe kal v'chomer ze miyad. K'she'amar le'HaKadosh Baruch Hu reid ki shichetem cha v'gomer. So, right, if you remember our Gemara in Yevamot, it had the teaching of he did a kal v'chomer from Korban Pesach to all the Torah. So the Maharsha says, why didn't he do that while he was still on Har Sinai? Because God told him at the beginning, go down. God told him in the beginning that Bnei Yisrael were doing Avodah Zarah, even when he was on top of Har Sinai. V'yesh lomar kedamrina b'midrash, efshar shelo haya Moshe ma'amin b'kadosh baruch hu, she'amar leki shichet v'gomer. Is it possible that Moshe didn't believe God when he told him that they were doing it? Elo odia liYisrael she'afilu ye'adam shomea mipi yechidi ne'eman lo, asur lekabel eduto v'lasot davar al piv. So here the Maharsha is quoting what we saw in Dvarim Rabbah. Right, in Dvarim Rabbah, we saw that Moshe was arguing on Bnei Israel's behalf. Right, he was trying to defend them and bring these things. Oh, the lucha, what you said in Aseret Dibra was in the singular, so maybe Bnei Israel didn't apply to them. Why is Moshe doing all that? To teach you that if a person hears even from Mipi Yechidi Ne'eman Lo, Asur Lekabel Eduto V'Lasot Davar Al Piv. You're never allowed to accept the testimony just based on one witness. Right? This is a crazy teaching here that the Maharsha says. He says, because it's God, right? It says, that's how strong this halacha is, that you're not allowed to accept the testimony from one witness. You need al pishnayim edim yakum davar. Because Moshe refused to believe that Bnei Yisrael were doing the Maseh Egel, even though he heard it from God, because God is only one witness. So therefore, that's why he didn't already go down to Har Sinai, because he refused to believe what God told him. So crazy. Ubali Karim Mamar Dalid Parsha Tedvav Tiretz, and here I think is kind of the most satisfying answer to the whole story is what the Bali Karim teaches. Shedavar hanir'eh le'einayim mitzaer adam tzar gadol yoter me'yediyah. Okay, which basically means seeing is believing. Which basically means when you see something with your eyes, you have it's different than hearing about it, right? That's what he says. It was all these different things, the midrashim that we saw Avodah Binatan, we saw the Gemara Menachos, we saw Pirkei Eliezer. They're giving different reasons for what's going on here. But Bali Karim says you don't have to. Right? Moshe is a human being, right? He's a great human being, but he's a human being, and even if God told him Bnei Yisrael were doing something, so he processed it intellectually. But when he actually saw them going and doing Avodah Zarah, it evoked a visceral response in him that he couldn't control. That's what the Bali Karim says. He says that's human nature. Because when you see something that's so shocking, it jars you in a way that even if you knew about it in advance, you didn't process it in the same way. And we can all we're all familiar with that aspect of human nature. She'adam yoter mitpa'el me'amurgash b'chush yoter mima sheyitpa'el me'anoda ba'amitut. A person is more moved by that which he feels emotionally than that which he is able to know intellectually. Right? He says also go see what the Mefarshim on the Torah say on this episode. Right? So I think just to kind of close, right, we saw that there's this question that underlies the whole story of the Maseh Egel of, right, did Moshe do the right thing, but also didn't he know about it already? And we saw that there's one tradition which is like in the Pirkei Eliezer, which tries to downplay Moshe's role from being active to perhaps more passive, and then the question falls away of hadn't he heard about it already on Har Sinai? Then we have midrashim which say no, Moshe had a very active role, like he consciously broke them and he even wrestled with the Shivim Zkenim and they had a tug of war, etc., etc. But the reason why he only got angry when he got down was because when he was on Har Sinai, he was so involved in trying to defend Bnei Israel from the accusations of God that he refused to believe what God told him, and it was only once he saw it that he had to accept it, and then he got angry because he'd been in he was in denial of what God had told him. And as the Maharsha says, it's even this halachic idea that you can't believe one witness even if it's God. And then I think, to me, perhaps the most satisfying answer is what the Maharsha says in the name of the Bali Karim, which is that you don't have to bring in all these other kind of more lavish responses, and you can just say that even if Moshe heard it, God told Moshe, and Moshe accepted it and heard what God had said, but once he actually saw them doing it, that led to him getting angry and breaking the luchot, just based on what human nature would normally dictate. Ad kan. Shkaya. Thank you guys.